So what we will do today here in the morning is to talk about river basin management and modeling in connection with that. And then the idea originally had been to go and do this game, which is called Aqua Republica, which is also about this. How do you handle river basins where you have all these different users that want water, who are maybe disagreeing on how this should be distributed. So what kind of tools and what are those situations like? What we will do a little bit instead is that we'll still go through the river basin management examples here, but then we'll go back and continue the exercise from yesterday on this tool that you now get to keep, and then we'll see how far we go. We'll also still be introducing this drought and flood and drought monitor tomorrow probably, and get exercises with that, and then we'll see on Friday if we have time and energy left. Maybe we'll do the game at the end. Okay, but let me then start by this river basin management and just the basic concept of this. So what we see here, if you can see that, is just one, you can say a sub-basin, so one area of land with different uses, right? So we have irrigated fields using either groundwater or surface water. There are industries, or towns, or maybe local storages and so on within that area. And if we want to look into how can we manage the water in such an area, we first of all need to know the water balance basically. So we need some kind of hydrological model typically, but at least the elements of that. What is the rainfall coming in? What is the flow coming in from upstream? What is the local runoff and so on? How much is the infiltration to groundwater from the land surface in this area? And when you're modeling an area with, at least with intensive irrigation, you will also have additional infiltration from the irrigated areas directly. So if an irrigated area takes water from a river passing through, some of this water will then infiltrate into the ground and be available as groundwater. Right? So we need to know how much is flowing in this river and how much water is taken off, for example, from this irrigated area here. How much do they take from the river? Maybe they take some from a local storage. It could be a tank down in Tamil Nadu or whatever, right, which is being used. Maybe they are, or some water, as I said, will infiltrate to groundwater, and some will probably seep back to the river. So all irrigated areas are drained, and these drains will then move water back to the river. The color is a bit different because the quality of that water may not be the same. Right? We have maybe domestic areas that are taking groundwater and have some wastewater that also go back to the river. So now the flow in this river is higher than it was before, because some of this groundwater has been pumped up past some houses or villages, towns, and then returned to the river. Same with industry, maybe taken from the river like that. So what actually flows here in the downstream is not just what runs off from the catchment. It's a combination of so many different things, right? Impacted both in quantity and quality. Maybe we need to make a reservoir, and maybe we even make hydropower on this reservoir to partly to supply water to these users and partly, of course, to get the power out of it. Right? So at the end of the day, what flows here, you can't just take a rainfall runoff model from the catchment and then calculate that very often, particularly not as you move downstream, and there are many of these structures and abstractions and whatever that influence it. This, of course, also raises the question, can you ever just use a rainfall runoff model? Because in every catchment there is always some people and there's always some use. But in most cases, the amount of natural runoff that comes is so much larger than the amount of water abstracted and moved around. That is okay. They're just sort of lumping them in a lump model, but merging that into the model, the effect of that. And like I said, it's often so small that even if you're looking at the future, say you're looking climate change, where also you have changes from the way people are using the water, very often you can neglect these because they're quite small. Okay, so that's yeah.
One thing this ideal basin model is lacking is the embankment along the river.
But that river basin models are quite different from the dynamic river models.
From Indian point of view, every river is embanked.
Yeah, but that it has no impact here, because a river basin model is on the quantities of water, how much water is available. The only questions that you ask this model and the only answer that comes out of that is there enough water for me, also in a dry year, to take this? Whether you take it over the embankment or through how you take it in and how it gets back in and out doesn't really matter in this case. If you're modeling, if you want to look at flood inundation, then of course you need your embankments or and other structures like that. But here we're only looking on quantities. So some of these models run on a monthly time step. So it's just what is the monthly inflow and monthly. We normally use daily because you get more accuracy in reservoir operations, for example. There might be a very high inflow over a few days that spills, which you don't see in the monthly data, right? But there's no dynamics, and models like this don't calculate water level, for example. It's only the amount, the discharge only. So where it is in the river and so on, you don't, details of that are not given. This is suited for planning of managing water resources. When you have these basins where you have the farmers down here who are crying for more water, and then this town growing from 1 million to 5 million people in 10 years and who want more and more water. Everybody wants water. How do you handle that? You typically here you have daily time series of 30, 40 years, and then you put in your water demands and run them through and see, do I have enough water for these? And when I don't, how do I then, what action can I take? How can I reduce the water for different uses? There'll be several examples on this, which hopefully makes you understand this better. Starting, well, actually I think I'll start with another one since you asked it like that. Let's start in Burkina Faso in Africa. So this is a country marked here in yellow, landlocked country. You have the Sahara Desert here, so this is a very dry area, right? The rainfall is very low. And within Burkina Faso is a river called Nakambe, which also holds the capital, Ouagadougou is the name. So this river basin has 40% of the population of the whole country. Water demands increasing and high national focus. This is a study we did 15 years ago or so, even 20 years ago, I think. Yeah, about that, 20 years ago. So within this basin, there are several reservoirs. There is, near the capital here, is a reservoir called Lumbila on this tributary. And it's got a volume of 35 million cubic meter, and the water demand is 14. And it actually fills every year. So offhand, you would think there's no problem, but we're getting back to that. Upstream is a natural lake here with 40 million cubic meter and quite small demands. There is a large reservoir in the south here called Bagre, which is used for hydropower and a little bit of irrigation, but a lot of volume. Then what happened here in the late 90s is that on the main Nakambe River here, a private person called Kanasoe, he built a dam. He's one of the richest people, he's probably dead now, but he's old rich man, a good friend of the president, and he had a construction company. And maybe they didn't have much to do, so and he comes from a village here in this area, right? So he made a dam across the river and to supply water to his people. He didn't ask anybody. I mean, can you imagine that? He just put up a dam there on the river. And it's not, I mean, they do have laws in this country. It is actually against the law, but when you're a good friend of the president, it's difficult, to really, anyway. And one of the problems in this is, of course, that it will then reduce the amount of water downstream. Here in the capital, they actually found that this reservoir, while it's relatively large, was not always enough. And the problem is that evaporation is very high, and these reservoirs are quite shallow. So the evaporation losses, they have like a wet season and then a dry season, right? And the evaporation losses in the dry season were so high that they were actually close to running out of water in 97, I think it was. So they decided to build a new reservoir here, 200 million cubic meters, as additional water supply to the capital. What then happened was that having gotten away with making the 7 million, which was here, he raised the dam, so now it was 70 million cubic meter. And so it was twice the volume of the reservoir, which is normally enough to supply water for 1 million people in the capital. And his village is maybe 10,000 or 20,000 like that. And this is also, generally the land is very flat here. So this is also a very shallow lake with a huge surface, right? Just evaporating, right? So really a waste of water. Again, nobody were able to stop him. I asked them, are you monitoring the water level in this lake that he is? The local authorities who are measuring, right? And they said no, and I said, well, you have to measure this, right? So I convinced them, go up, put up a staff gauge at least, and hire somebody to read. He said, nobody will read there, because, I mean, they were all sort of under this Mr. Kanasui. So the only reading would then be whenever they from the capital would drive up and see what is the level, right? So eventually they did that, they put up the staff gauge, but first time they came to check it, it was gone. Anyway, but that's the situation. Also in 2000, this private reservoir upstream, they had now, were building this reservoir here. We were looking in general in this study for the future at that time, so 20 years ago. And the demands for water supply for the capital particularly were increasing. So the question was, to a large extent, how can you use the reservoirs and what is the most efficient water use in general in a basin like this? So what we had done was to generate 38 years of runoff in all these different subcatchments here. We had some measurements of flow at different locations. Sometimes it was 5 years, then only 3, then a few were very long like that. So different duration of these. And then rainfall. So we could use rainfall runoff model on subcatchments all the way around, and then generate these long time series of flow. So there were some back in the 60s, some rather wet years, some dry years here, very dry period here, and this is where they were running out of water. But quite some variation within this. We could then, so we checked the model partly by simulating the variation of the level in that reservoir, which is supplying the capital. And here you can also see how it goes down. At 2 meters, it's out of water, so it was just touching the bottom at that time. So we put all this in the model and looked into how should you operate these to meet demands. Looking at only this Lumbila, if the plan is we just supply whatever the demand is, the demand, and now we're looking at future demands, if we try to supply that every year, and the climatic variation will be the same as it has been before, how will we manage? Right? So this is maybe a little bit complicated. We're looking at the future, let's say 2030. Right? We estimate how much water do they need in 2030. We don't know whether that will be a wet year or a dry year or an average year, whatever that will be. What we do know is how has the runoff been from that catchment for those 38 years, right? So assuming, forgetting climate change for a while, assuming that it's going to be a similar kind of variation, then we take all those years, starting in 1961 here, and saying if 2030 is like 61, how will that be with that abstraction amount of water which we are going to abstract in 2030? How will this perform, right? So the reservoir is going to go down like this and back up again, no problem. This is the limit, right? So most of the years, it'll actually be fine. Even that one reservoir will, in most of the years, not have any problems. But then there's 1 year here where we just touch the bottom, several years here where we're actually out of water. And here in these very dry years at the end, it's, we're actually out of water for more than half a year. So more than 6 months, there's no water supply to the capital at all, which of course is not possible. Right? And this may come again. Right? So we start looking into what can we then do about it. And after a number of analysis and tests and so on, we came up with some rule curves. And this is now, again, the water level in the reservoir. And what these rule curves say that if your water level at this time, let's say here, let's say 1st of February here, which is here, if we're up around 5.5 meters, no problem. You supply all the water they want, that's fine. If we are below 5 here, in this reach, then we only give 50% of the demands. And if we're below both these two curves, we go down to 30%. So the curves vary over the year, more or less as the water level in the reservoir. So we actually need, in September, we need to be above 6 meters in order to give full supply. Right? So those rules are there, and if we run with that, we actually manage to stay above and just touch the bottom here in 97, also with this increased demand. Right? So if we're looking at least 90s directly, what we show here is those reduction levels are there in blue. This light blue is the first reduction level. What's the other one? The red curve here, which is also repeated every year, is the second one. And then the actual level, the one called niveau here, is what is simulated in the model. So here the actual level is above both the curves. We're supplying all the water they need. Here it follows a bit the upper, then it passes that, and then here it goes below both of them. And here is a period, for example, where it's below both the two curves. So from August 95 to, but basically for a year, more than a year, it would be 30%. So if 2030 is similar to that, they're only going to get 30% of their water demand. And here again, a long period where they're not getting what they actually ask for. So statistically, you can say this is what the water demand is. What they get in average is about half in the dry season and then a bit more in the wet season. So the only way, I mean, now of course they're building that other reservoir, but otherwise the only way of handling this is to say you cannot get the water you need. You have to make do with this, right? But it's not so bad in this case. The water demand included washing the car and watering the garden and all these things that you can live without. I mean, you can go quite low before it's really critical. And the main thing is, of course, they need to be able to drink and cook and these things. Okay, but as I mentioned, generally this is a very flat terrain. So instead of being like a cup, all the reservoirs are like the sources here, right? And if you look at how water is actually used in the basin, well, we have irrigation and water supply to Ouagadougou, and if we turn all this in cubic meter per second, values are like this: 0.11 here, 0.86, 0.4. The power, that's in megawatt. Down here is 5.43, and the value of the power is a bit more than $5 million. The evaporation, also in cubic meter per second, from the different reservoirs, adds up to 12 cubic meter per second in average. So graphically it's like this. All these brown and orange, yellow colors, that's evaporation losses. The water which is being used for irrigation is this dark blue, and the water supply to Ouagadougou is this one. So 10% of the water in the reservoirs is being used for people. The rest just disappears up in the thin air. Yeah, we're close to, again, this is close to Sahara. Potential evaporation, I think, is more than 2 meters, and all the reservoirs look like this, so the depth is very, very shallow. Right? And that goes for all of them, including Mr. Touessé from Mr. Kanasui. Let's see, he's got 1.62 cubic meter per second is the evaporation in average all year round, right? This is and like I said, it's 10,000 people or so. How much do they use in average per second? I mean, really?
For meeting the demands, the only solution you told about is you reduce the demand, like you put a brake over it. But what could be the possible solutions other than reduction of demand?
Yeah. The other one is the one they're actually going for, which is that they have now built another reservoir. So they have, groundwater is not an option, unfortunately, here. There's some quality issues, but also the amount is not very difficult to find and so on. They made this other reservoir, which is also, like all the others, very, very shallow, but much larger. We looked a bit into this. I mean, when you're losing so much water, could you actually do something about it? And one thing we tried here was a scenario where we took this new reservoir they had just constructed and actually removed it again, just to see what is the impact of that. It's quite large, right? And if we do that, we go up to 15% efficiency. So now we only lose 15% of the water because the evaporation has gone down. If we also remove that reservoir, which was put up by this private man up here, we're up to 18%, right? So the losses go down a lot. At the same time, the power production then increases, because down here you have this hydropower, right? And the amount of water that then is allowed to continue all the way down here increases the value of the power production by $1 million per year, right? But of course, now they're building this reservoir, you can't just remove it. You might be able to remove the one upstream, right? But so how about changing the operations? This new reservoir, Sika, once they made that, the first thing they did was to fill it up. And of course, they invested a lot of money and they want to see that. And they actually filled it up even before they had the pipeline to the town ready. So it would fill up and spill, right? So a nice big lake, very beautiful, all that, planting trees and so on. Sitting there evaporating, right? With 200 million cubic meters of water. And you still had the town water supply being 14 still. Increasing, but not near 200, right? With that new reservoir filled up completely, over our almost 40 years of data, the water level would stay high most of the time. There's a dry period here in the 80s where it would go down a bit, but otherwise it would annually just vary like this in volume and water level, right? With large losses. So, yeah?
Is there any way to reduce the evaporation from the water?
Not really. I mean, on small reservoirs, you could try to make a film of some oily material which sort of put a lid on it, but you don't want to put oil on a drinking water reservoir, right?
Maybe the architecture of the storing the water, like...
I mean, reservoirs are huge, right? Lakes.
So underground water storage.
How can you reduce the evaporation?
Yeah, you can't.
So
I mean,
storing water underground could be the solution.
Yeah.
Like,
there are some. I think it's even been tried in some areas to artificially increase the infiltration and. But comparing, I mean, if you look at all the cost and the efficiency of this, I mean, if you infiltrate into the ground, you still have to pump it back up again, and there are many issues like that, right? So it's not really no. You find the location where the topography is like this and where it's not like that, right? But we looked into here. What we did was instead of keeping the level so high, we would fill it up to a lower level. This new reservoir where they don't need all that water, if they only fill it up to lower levels here, the evaporation goes down, the discharge downstream increases, and therefore the power production downstream increases, and they could gain, this is now in local currency, but they could gain quite some funds by just not filling that reservoir up completely, right? And satisfy all demands. Yeah, this is about $100,000 US per year gained by just opening the gates instead of filling it completely. How about this upstream then, which had 70 million cubic meters of storage and a large area and basically not use anything? If we also for that lower the maximum level well, then we come up to about 200,000. So they could basically open 2 gates and gain $200,000 per year for the country, right? Or for the power production. Anyway, for the country, right? Otherwise, they have to import power from other sources, right? They didn't do it. I mean, it's interesting. You work with these things in water resources, and you show this is a consequence of this. And I mean, we even we sat down and wrote a letter to the parliament, just in 1.5 pages, to explain, you know, how this is done and how a very simple solution could actually make them a lot of money. It didn't happen. And it's politics, right? I mean, again, this guy, Konesui, who built that reservoir, talked to the president, nonsense, you know, never mind. You know, right? Yeah, and it's, yeah. But as technicians, all we can do is, you know, demonstrate, show what are actually the consequences, and then it's up to others. We didn't have a chance, and we wouldn't make this public, but that could be the other way around, that you call a journalist and you tell them, see what has been done. If we had done this study earlier and been more involved in this construction of that reservoir, we could have showed them that what they should do was, once it's finished, they only fill it to some level. And then, of course, reserve all the land where it's eventually going to be, but they fill it like that and then take water from this, right? Then they would be seen as very intelligent. They are and very environmentally concerned, and you know, and considering also the hydropower, we have really done this, you know, very carefully, and then slowly they could always increase the level as demands grow, right? So that would have been the way of doing it. But once they have this beautiful lake, which had been in the news and all that, it's difficult to admit, oh, sorry, this was a bad idea. Now we're going to lower it, right? So.
You have tried to lower the spillway, or you have tried to eliminate one of the reservoirs. So what about the rainfall and floods effect on them? Yeah,
flooding is a very small problem. I mean, this is near to the Sahara Desert. It's not. It doesn't really occur, right? But the big reservoir, Sicker downstream, has gates. So that was just a question of opening. The upper one was actually built without gates, so that would have to be put in. But with that amount of money, the government could even finance the gate, right? So I think that's probably it for this one. Yeah, I think we'll actually skip that one, but take another one from Africa here, which is also a bit political. So this is a river called the Niger River, which is shared by 9 countries. So starting up here and then flowing up near the Sahara Desert through Burkina Faso here down to Niger, and then Nigeria, which is the largest, in population, the largest country in Africa down here. So they're the downstream ones. This is the active river basin. There's actually also a river basin up here or it's higher located in Sahara, but since it doesn't rain up there, it doesn't contribute really. So we're using one of these river basin models. You have runoff into different branches of the model, can take groundwater for water supply, reservoirs are built in, different users can take water out, and so calculating inflow, outflow, natural runoff from the subcatchments, and then the water use like that. So a bit the same as we did before. So we had all these different sub-basins along the river, and then we put in all the existing dams, which are green, and they are mainly down here in Nigeria. And then there's a lot of proposed dams. All the purple ones are proposed, many up here in the upstream and then several down here. But Nigeria, as the downstream country, we're telling all the upstream, don't build anything, because it's a waste of water, right? Let it come down to us. We'll produce a lot of power that you can buy cheaply, and you know, don't trust. And again, politically, it was difficult for the upstream countries who were smaller and weaker to do anything, right? There were so many users. I mean, this is a million square kilometer catchment area. So many water users. So what we did was group many of them. So in one user, but a user, you could say, all the users in that region would be put in the model as one user, and that would contain some domestic supply and some irrigation, small-scale irrigation and so on. The larger irrigation would be separate and so on. So But all these uses were there. And then again, we generated runoff for some period of time, about 25 years or so was possible. And again, some wet periods and some dry periods. And again, the idea was here, let this be a representative variation of the runoff from the subcatchment, and then we look at future conditions with future dams, future demands, and so on, and then see for the same climate what would happen. Climate change is relatively simple. Once, if you know how it changes, you just change your runoff time series accordingly, right? But this is still some years back. This was 2005, and not part of our task to do that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was the methodology you employed to arrive at the demands in 2025?
Well, here we asked the countries, because they already had these estimates. They have estimates of how the population grows and so on. So all the countries were participating in this, and they did that via an organization called the Niger Basin Authority, which has people from all these countries, and they have all the numbers, the data, and all that. So.
And was the increase in temperature also a factor in arriving in?
Not at this stage, no. They didn't consider that at this stage. So it was mainly the population growth and growth in.
So climate change was not considered.
Not directly, but you could easily have done that. I mean, here in
Studies in India, we do consider
Yeah,
climate
yeah.
change and increase in temperature as
Right,
one of the
right.
dominant factors.
yes, but it would not.
Climate change will change.
Yeah. But in this case, the expectations in the growth and demand from partly population growth, which is very high in this, but also they're all expecting to be richer, and rich people use more water than poor people. Right? So the demands are really increasing dramatically. They expected. Whether it actually happens, I don't know, but much more actually than climate change would have induced in this case. But it's
I suppose you have a study from India also.
Yeah. That we'll see in a minute. One special thing about this particular river is that this is a highland, and then it comes down to a flat area where it actually creates an inland delta, which inundates large areas here and have huge evaporation, and then it flows out on the other end. So that has a big impact also on the water availability downstream, of course. Here are some hydrographs, if you can see those. So the inflow like this, and then what comes out is this red one. About 6 weeks later it peaks, and the volume is much smaller than what actually came in. So we described that by putting in some artificial, some different branches and reservoirs and so on, so we could simulate the variation of the downstream flow through our period here, and water level at some locations also. So the runoff was then mainly from this upstream, then in the delta, that was all included in this delta model, and then downstream. And high runoff in the lower part and in the upper part, and very little in the intermediate part here. Corresponding also to how the rainfall pattern is, with almost no rainfall in the Sahara area. But then, of course, we had all these countries involved, and somehow with this model we could look into how to handle future demands. And one thing that was clear was that we couldn't meet all the demands. So what we did, or actually our partner, a French company called BRLI, who was involved in this, at one of the workshops, they had all the countries present, and then they said, let's talk about water use in general. What is most important? I mean, if we can't supply to everybody, who gets the water first? And of course, drinking water comes as number one, right? Okay, what's number two? That turned out to be livestock. So typically these people living out there, they have a few goats or whatever, and which don't take much water, and it would be very bad not to give them water. So they were number two. Small-scale industry came in some number three, which might be surprising, but still, again, the water demands are small, and it's very important for the livelihood that they can keep the industries going. Then minimum supply to perennial crops, so crops that are grown for, like sugarcane is more than a year and so on. And if it's already growing and you have a dry period, keep that going, right? This Ramsar site has some minimum flow requirements, and they actually put that as number 5. Then came irrigation for local food production, for other crops, for navigation, all crops, additional water to ecosystem. They decided not to prioritize hydropower at all, but just produce whenever water was from a reservoir released for use downstream, then you can produce power at that time, right? So that was the order. And then what we did was we took all these different uses we have made, and then we said, okay, how much of, if the requirement of this user is 100, how much of that is drinking water? That was maybe 1. Okay, so we had the lowest level was then I think drinking water and livestock was grouped. That was level 1. And then we reduced all the water demands to level 1, made the analysis for the model all through the dry and wet years, and see if we, with the existing reservoirs and whatever we have, if we want to supply that level, do we do that in the whole period? And the answer was yes. Okay, then we went to the next level where we included the next one and tried that, and slowly increased step by step. And at one point, there would be periods where we couldn't supply water to everybody. And then we started looking into what are these proposed reservoirs or other changes that are considered. If we build 1 or 2 of these reservoirs, would that then help? And then yes, then we can get to a higher level, right? So we tried all sorts of combination with what's called iso-satisfaction, so same level of satisfaction in terms of that list, forgetting whether it's this country or that country, right? It's people who need water, right? So supplying on that same level, also actually running through an economic model to look at how much crop do we produce and what are conditions on in these different scenarios now where we have don't do anything, build 1 reservoir here, build this combination of reservoirs and so on. A range of these scenarios, running them through our model and looking into what are then the most attractive scenarios. This was actually just set up in Excel in those days, and you can then look into for scenarios the like relative water deficit. When would that happen, and in which part would that occur? What is the production of rice? What is the fish production? The habitat area throughout the years and so on, livestock and reservoir conditions. So you could extract a lot of different kind of results of the model there, and then and also calculate what is the hydropower production, right? So it made it possible to compare in scenarios the overall conditions, and like I said, forgetting national borders, right? And the conclusion here's an interesting one actually. Navigation was one of the demands, you can say. I mean, they have on that river, they sail up to as far as upstream as they can, and there's one town called Manonville which is exporting all the local product produced via the river. So can they do that all year round? Well, already now they can't. But looking into how often they can do that, what we did was to make flow duration curves, because it was known that if you had a discharge of around 500 cubic meters per second, then you have enough water level and enough water in the river to actually sail on it with the big ships. So 2 scenarios are shown here. In this scenario where we have this duration curve at that location, it's only about 45% of the time that you can navigate on that river. In this other scenario, we're almost at 70%, right? So just from the duration curve, you can see that directly. After this dam, they actually decided or after this project, they started construction of 2 of these reservoirs that have been proposed, and had been proposed 20 years earlier, but Nigeria had been rejecting them. So we see that as, we were not involved anymore, but we see that as a result of this process. And it wasn't something we did, but we worked with this local organization or international organization called the Niger Basin Authority, and they were the one who were the owner of the model and understanding and could run this. They used it themselves, and they could then talk to their ministers and say, look, this is the consequence of this is the consequence of that. And then there might have been some political trade. I mean,
for intervention here?
Since there is a vast network of these dams which have been constructed over this river, what could be its impact on the e-flow of the river? Because it could be having devastating
Yeah.
consequences so far as the very ecology
Yeah.
of the area is concerned.
If you
What about the e-flow?
Yeah, that was considered also, and it was ranked quite high in the list. And you can actually see on this this duration curve. The red one is the one basically the current conditions, and in the blue a lot of reservoirs have been constructed, so the average flow is much lower, as you can see. But the curve continues here, and here it actually ends up slightly higher. When we're down to the very low flow, the low flow is available here in 98% of the time, whereas on the current conditions it was only 95 or so.
And this
So E-flow has increased by the reservoirs. Increased by the
how
reservoirs.
that is possible?
Because the rules of the reservoirs, reservoir operation has been that E-flow has been prioritized very high. So when flow goes very low, you then release that rather than giving it to the irrigation and the other users. And when you have several reservoirs, you also have more control of the river and can therefore release water in periods where natural runoff is not there.
Because I suppose the fishing sector is one of the important economic sectors in this area.
That's clearly
So
part
they
of
are
it.
supposed to maintain that e-flow
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
survival of this sector.
It was at least, I mean, in this list that I showed here, let's see if we go back up here. This list had minimum flows as number 5, right, in priority. Before irrigation of local food production, before irrigation of other crops and navigation and so on.
This is one aspect. Second is, so far as this whole demand estimation is concerned, which has certain basic assumptions for the estimation of the water demand, so far as the different sectors are concerned. Is this a priced commodity there, water? So far
Is it what?
priced commodity? I mean, so some tariff is being levied on?
That varies from country to country, but some of them do have prices, yes.
Because I have gone through some reports while given the demand graph so far as the different sectors, including the population sector is concerned, there has been a reasonable reduction in the demand when it has become a very priced commodity, when some tariffs have been imposed. Because always you will find a gap between the false demand and the exact demand. Exaggerated demand is there when this is not a priced commodity there.
No.
When you are putting up certain type of tariff here, the demand, there is a reduction in the demand, and that becomes the real demand. Always there is a huge gap between the exaggerated demand. When this is not a levied, I mean to say, when this commodity is not levied.
I know that Malawi.
So that type of the component should be always there while making the realistic estimations about the demand. So far as
You're quite right.
The awareness level of the users actually. If the users are aware, then they would use the water judiciously. Like in our place, in most of the European countries, people are very aware and they don't waste water as such. UK also, I think the water is not priced as such. It is available free of cost.
I don't know, but in Denmark it's very costly.
and most of the countries, some sort of tariff is being levied on this. In most, whether irrespective of developing or development.
The health services are free in Denmark?
What is?
Health service.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are, you could say, free. So health service is free, education is free, including also at universities. Roads are good, transport is a little bit costly, I think. But free means that our taxes are enormously, right? I mean, it means, you can say what we do is we all share the cost of these things. Right?
Because when we have introduced these components in this river basin, this no more remains a river basin water. Why? Because you are putting a lot of economic dimensionality in this model. So it becomes sort of a water budgeting model. This becomes sort of a water budgeting model. If we are introducing the economic dimensionality in this, this no more remains a river basin model. This becomes a water budgeting model.
But I mean, the model itself is always looking into the water and distribution. And but then you work with, of course, looking into the demands. And this thing about pricing is often, like I say, an efficient tool. It has, of course, to be introduced in a way that also poor people can afford drinking, right? So in many countries you say, okay, this amount is free. If you want more than that, then it costs this much. If you want even more, then the price per liter goes up, and then so there are different models to do that. In Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in Africa, they actually charge for water, And there we helped, we made a system for them to actually manage the invoicing so looking into water demands, but also how do you handle all this? How do you check that money has come in from this, and how do you grant new permissions to take more water also for irrigation and so on? So that kind of system has always been made, but it is a tool that is often quite efficient if used with social awareness, you could say. I think we'll just do DSS planning that Sanjay knows very well. We worked together with that for before the tea, which is in half an hour, and then maybe we'll meet back here, I think. Or let's just see after DSS planning what we do. You know the hydrology project, right? So it started back with hydrology project 1 from 95 onwards, which was mainly on improving data collection, and then the states that have been in HP1 also were in HP2 generally, where several decision support systems were developed. And DHI was involved in this DSS planning and a real-time decision support for BBMB, and then on Krishna Bhima also real-time flood flow forecasting and so on. But DSS planning had these 9 states and 6 central agencies, with NIH being the main agency involved, and then all these basically southern states or central southern states, and each of these selected a river basin that they would focus on, so it would be their main basin as part of the project here. The idea was to make a decision support system to decide on water management first of all, but also, since data is still a big issue here, we then included facilities that are very similar to what is in your little tool here on Mike Workbench, for GIS and time series data, but also models, of course, in the system that can calculate what are the consequences of changing or major changes in a basin, like building reservoirs and so on, but also looking on shorter term with the existing infrastructure. How should we use that in the coming dry season or wet season, like that, coming year or so? So the river model, we've been through that. A lot of functionalities just on time series, making statistics, duration curves, resampling like that. Looking at the data directly, this map over here is based on measurements of the fluoride in groundwater. No modeling, no calculation. It just shows in color code here, the darker, the higher concentration of fluoride. And fluoride, as you know, is found in groundwater. It's a problem. You can't really do much about it, except monitor where is it. Sometimes it moves, or the concentration changes and so on. But maps like that, if you make those over several years, you can also see, is there actually a movement? Which areas are really bad? Where can we probably go and look for groundwater? So give an overview like that. Similarly, you can take rainfall or other information and just have the color, change the color according to the value. This is actually also available in that tool that we'll make exercise with, this Mike Workbench. If you associate a time series to the dots which represent the station, then you can then let it make the map and say color them according to the average or the maximum or some other statistics. Right? Google Earth. But here is in this upper beamer, this map is showing the watersheds that are classified as safe, and these are green. If they are semi-critical, they're purple, and overexploited, they're in this brown color. So this is the local groundwater authorities who have made this classification, and overexploited is typically where you see the groundwater level falling year by year. They're using more than what's coming in. On the same map are these squares, and they are showing within that particular area what is the amount what is the irrigation demand, how much are they taking out. So here are, for example, some safe areas with very light colors, so very little groundwater use. This is up in the mountains, basically. and the darker red, the more extraction. So these overexploited areas all have quite dark colors. So directly from the data here, you can see that yes, they're overexploited, but the extraction of groundwater is also very high. So it's not because the infiltration is low, it's because they're actually extracting more than comes in, which is high value. Right? So again, no modeling, but just having maps and indicators like that, you can understand a lot about conditions in river basins. Right? So this upper Bima was our pilot basin, selected because it's got these areas of overexploited groundwater, in generally drought-prone areas. There is competition between domestic, industrial, and agricultural demands. They are operating reservoirs, several reservoirs jointly, and can maybe improve the way that this is done. They have potential, at least, for conjunctive use of surface and groundwater, and there is some pollution also. So all the problems that you might look into are actually found within this basin. So we selected that one and made models focusing on surface water where we have all the reservoirs. I think there are about 20 reservoirs, mainly here upstream, but also one downstream here and here and there, and generated runoff for almost 40 years to make these analyses here. For the groundwater was subdivided a bit differently because they work with some other watersheds there. And we had all these groundwater and water users. The small houses are representing a groundwater use within these. So getting the data in and then making a number of different tools and analysis as part of this DSS. One was a relatively simple one, which is just predicting the recession of the groundwater level. So if by the end of the monsoon they measure that at this particular area, the groundwater is about 2 meters above, below ground level. So we have water there. How will that recede? And that will, of course, be partly a function of how much water will they be extracting. So the estimates of how much they are taking. But then also there's natural losses to downstream base flow is just flowing out. Right? So a combination of the base flow and the use will then lower, was the prediction here, to about 6.5. Actually, it didn't come quite as low in this year. So here we are comparing with what actually happened, which is this blue line going up and down, and then these predictions made in this way. We looked into...
Sorry for intervention here. Whether this has been done separately for the pre-monsoon session and the post-monsoon?
This was done in cooperation with the groundwater authorities there, only to predict what happens in the dry season.
Because there have been substantial fluctuations so far as the groundwater scenario is concerned between the post-monsoon and the pre-monsoon scenario.
Yeah.
Yes.
But what they wanted here is it was only this. That's what they looked for in this particular tool. A lot of different tools were made. Another thing we looked into is artificial recharge. So we selected one of these watersheds, which is here, and within that we had then the current water abstraction, and we knew the hydrology, you can say, in this area, and then looked into, would it be possible to artificially increase the infiltration to the groundwater? So more groundwater would it be available in the dry season? And that could be check dams, which is used across India a lot. You could use an abandoned well. If a dug well 10 meters deep or so is not there anymore, fill it up with stones, divert surface water over and let it maybe filter it a bit if you can for sediments, and then let it infiltrate. Right? Tanks that exist, send more water into the tanks. Some water seeps down from the tanks and so on. So what we did was we assessed the capacity of all these proposed structures of check dams and so on, what would be possible in that area, then accumulated that infiltration capacity and also the losses, because if you infiltrate in, let's say you take a tank and increase the water there and then also increase the level, then you will lose more water, right? And typically from a tank like that, the evaporation is maybe 5 times as high as the recharge. So if that is artificial recharge, it's to a large extent also artificial evaporation, right? the wells would be much more efficient, because if you just divert a little stream and then in a well which is, I don't know, 4 meters in diameter, quickly infiltrate from that, there's not much evaporation loss from that, and it can hopefully go quickly down. Right? So on this exercise, you can say, what we decided was to say, let's assume that in future, compared to 2010, the pumping of groundwater, so the abstraction would increase by 50%. The percolation capacity of this artificial recharge would be 4 cubic meters per second, 20% only is lost. So that's very optimistic, but just for this case. And another assumption was you can abstract down to 16 meters, but not any lower than that. So on the actual condition, with this increased pumping, but none of the artificial recharge, over these almost 40 years, if we started 4 meters below level, we would have been going down here in the 70s in this dry period, so we hit 16, up again a bit, but generally being down here. With the artificial recharge, it then performs much better and is within that level all the time, right? So that's relatively good. So here is a question for, let's see, how do we do this? Now maybe let me just highlight this area here. Before the artificial recharge, we were at about 9 meters depth at this time, and then after a few years we hit 16. So we go down by 7 meters in this period. With the artificial recharge, we go from 3 to 11, or 10 maybe. So that's also 7 meters. Why does the groundwater level fall the same in those two cases? I mean, we have the artificial recharge in place. Why do we still have this same drop in groundwater level in a period here where the level goes down? Construction. The extraction is the same in the two cases. The rainfall is the same and the abstraction is the same, but we have in this blue. Yeah, but this blue curve is that represent a period where we have this artificial recharge in place. So why does it fall just as steeply? Why doesn't it fall slower? Suction, yeah, but the suction is the same in the two cases. The natural recharge is the same, the abstraction is the same, so that makes it the same. But then we have artificial recharge structures with these different wells where you can divert water and infiltrate it, and you have whatever is built in there, and which if you look at another time, like look at this here. Here, before the groundwater level went up here by maybe 3 meters. Here it goes up by 5 meters because of our artificial recharge. Why does it fall the same in this period? Why doesn't it fall less? Okay, let me help you by saying
Some well may be constructed nearby.
No, well, it's not. That's not. What do you think? Is this a dry period or a wet period?
Wet period.
Wet? The groundwater level falls by 7 meters. Is that a wet period? It's a dry period. How much surface water do you have to infiltrate in a dry period? The problem is actually that the surface runoff available in this, it doesn't rain, right? It hardly rains at all. So even though we have all these structures to infiltrate artificially, we don't have the water. The water just isn't there. So you can't infiltrate artificially even though you have the structures. So in those periods it goes down, but then whenever there's a wet year, it goes a bit higher up, and that's why we actually manage it. Then what happens at the end here, if you look at the last few years, even without any artificial recharge, you see that the water level rises. So this must have been a very wet period. We can agree on that. With the artificial recharge, it stays more or less constant. Why is that then? Why doesn't it raise also with the artificial recharge? The water level is more or less the same now. What happens now?
because it's not getting down very drastically, like it is not getting.
Hydraulic gradient line.
Yeah, you have a bit of a right. Yeah, because here we are very near the surface, and the base flow losses are very high. It just disappears, right? So there's lots of water, but it just disappears. Anyway, if we look at surface water planning, we looked a lot at Pune town, which has increased from 1 million population to something like 5 million over the last maybe 20 years. They have some reservoirs here that they're using and operating jointly, Kataguaslas here and 3 upstream. These were set up for irrigation in this area near Pune, but now increasingly the town wants the water, right? So there's this conflict between them. So we made models for that, also putting in the hydropower in these dams and the abstraction. And first of all, just a relatively simple model where you have the reservoirs built in, and then you have the town as one water user, you have the irrigation as one water user, and some other water users like that. And then we actually made a facility on the internet where you can go and change the demands, and you can change other things and run a scenario, and then get statistics back on how do the tanks perform, how does the irrigation perform in the town, and so on. People didn't really use it, as far as I know, and it was only active for some time. One of the things we noticed on the irrigation in this area was that with demands of, in this case of 130, we had to release 180 because of losses on the way. The supply to the actual farmers there was 90, a bit more than 90, and then there was a deficit of 40 like that. So a lot of losses took place, and part of that was actually unauthorized users. They knew that there were people along the channel who were just pumping and using the water and didn't do anything about it. And that apparently happens, but at least they knew and had an estimate of how much it was. So looking into, can we increase water availability and the way it's operated? And one of the suggestions from the local people that we work with, the local authorities, was to make a transfer between these two reservoirs. This is Warisgan and Panchit reservoirs are the closest reservoirs in the world. It takes 5 minutes to walk from this dam to that dam. And they had noticed that this Panchit, very often in the rainy season, it would start filling up first, and then the other would come after. So there would be a level difference. Then this would fill up and spill, and sometimes this would not fill completely. So some water would have been spilled that could have been stored over here perhaps. So what about making a tunnel between these two? And when this is higher, let the tunnel transfer water over here, and then make it a one-way tunnel so it doesn't go the other way, you could say. Right? So we looked into that and ran it for the whole period, but here we zoomed in for just some 7 years or so. The black and the blue and the green line is the water level in the two reservoirs. So in the dry season it falls, and in the wet season it goes up. And here on this scale it's difficult to see which rises the first. But also on the graph on this black lines here is the discharge in that tunnel. So here in 92 there would have been a little discharge at this time and at that time. In 93 nothing. Quite a lot in 94, a little 95 like that. So year by year we could see which year could we transfer and how much. And based on that calculate what is the combined storage by the end of the monsoon. And with the transfer it's then the upper line generally, and without the transfer it's then the lower line. So years like this you would end up around 620 without transfer and 670 with the transfer. If we looked at the last 10 years, there would be absolutely no difference. So if this analysis had been done on 10 years, the conclusion would have been, doesn't make no difference, right? But having this longer period, at least we could find some years where it made a difference. Still, it turned out that the value of that water compared to the cost of the channel, so the benefit cost couldn't really justify actually constructing it.
What is the distance between the two reservoirs?
A kilometer or so, I mean, half kilometer, yeah.
They are separated by a ridge,
Yeah,
single ridge.
so,
That was the reason they built.
Yeah.
yeah.
See, I have a question. You showed in your slide that in Bhima there are a series of reservoirs. There are
Yeah.
15, 20 reservoirs. So, did you also look at the optimal operation of the reservoirs?
Yeah, we looked at this joint operation of how you could best do that, and also a little bit considering the hydropower production. So we made recommendations for, depending on what the water level is, basically rule curves, right? So we suggested rule curves. They had some rule curves that were very similar already. So whether they actually went for that suggestion or kept the old ones, I'm not sure.
Did the decision support system provided them any real-time operation module? Like that?
In this case, they also got real time, but actually under another project that was running in parallel. The real time actually requires all this real time data. So you need your real time monitoring the rainfall, what is the water levels, what are actual conditions, actual abstractions, all these things, and then weather forecast for short term, and then you're running that. We'll talk a bit about that probably tomorrow or so. But so in real time, you can then also take decisions. You can even run optimization in real time, but I think I'm going to touch upon that tomorrow. So we had this transfer. In the overall model of these 4 reservoirs, we had like the town as one user, as I mentioned, the irrigation as one user, but you could also look into details in the irrigation. So we did that also. We took the irrigated area, which is here, and then looked into how can you do anything within that, for example, by using this conjunctive surface and groundwater use. Right? So now detailing in watersheds within this area, what is the water used by domestic users? What is irrigation within each of these areas? And here we then also included these unauthorized users. So the brown guys over here on the right bank are unauthorized users, actually taking whatever they want and uncontrolled. Right? The only ones we could control or look into was inside. So we looked into 2 scenarios that I'm showing here. We looked into more, but the 2 here, one is that all these users can just take water out of the channel whenever they want. So this first user would just take the water when there's water in the channel, and only if there's no water would they use groundwater. The same here. So you just take whatever you want. The other scenario that you have some restriction on this, right? So for each of these, after some calculation, we came up with of course, if you just, with what is the optimal amount you should take? That this first one, the best thing would be if they only take 65% of their water from the channel and then use groundwater for the rest. 70% on this one, 80, 65, 80. And then, of course, the last one would take 100% if there is water in the channel, but otherwise groundwater. The impact of that would then be that the reliability for the different basins here, in the first scenarios where it was unrestricted, of course the upstream ones had almost 100% reliability. The last one had 11%. So most of the time they wouldn't have enough water. If we take this conjunctive use, we're still up in the 90s for all these upstream ones, and then the last one goes up to 84. Instead of so a much more even distribution. Still, they are suffering a bit, being the last ones, tail end, but much better than before. And the total deficit for all of them, in average, went from 28 to 10, because they are actually now using more water. The upstream, when they don't use any groundwater at all, whatever infiltrates just goes into the drains, right, and disappears. But if they use groundwater, there's less drainage loss, you can say, and more locally more water available. So for this irrigation scheme, all in all, if they cooperate, right, that could be a way of increasing the efficiency, and without getting more water from the reservoir, they actually have higher crop production. You could then also look into what happens further downstream, because now with the drainage is reduced, it means the downstream water availability is also reducing. Right? We did something similar in AP under this SRS, where you had groundwater levels over some period of time in two scenarios, again with and without conjunctive use. Head-end, never any problems, same in the middle. In the lower, there was a falling trend before, and then we could then change that to at least a constant trend in the groundwater. Then there's this story for the Pauna Reservoir. This is also part of this Upper Bima, and while we were doing this project, there was actually a conflict taking place where farmers were protesting over a pipeline which was planned from this reservoir called Pauna to an industrial area. So police were there, people were killed, and it was in the news. Pauna Reservoir operated at that time in the way that it would just send water through the hydropower plant down the river, and then down here would be drinking water extraction, some irrigation, but most of the water would actually be taken to PCMC here, which is an irrigation area. As I remember, it's about, on average, they release 7 cubic meter per second, and they need 5 cubic meter per second. So this is clearly the highest user. They have to pump the water, lift it 62 meters, and they pump this 5 cubic meter per second on average, lifting 64 meters. So that's quite expensive for them to lift it. If they can get a pipeline, it could come by gravity all the way. Right? But the farmers are those living along this river. And they, of course, are very happy to see water in the river all year round, which is not natural in a river like that. But for them, it's very easy. They pump it out and no charge, and they have irrigation. Right? So naturally, they protest. Right? So we set it up in this DSS, which also has a spreadsheet functionality. So directly from the models, we could extract to this spreadsheet the key numbers. So what is the average water supply, for example, for the groundwater users, for the irrigation, for the industry, and so on. And all the green areas or the increase is green if it's actually positive, and then it's red if it's negative. So groundwater users will, of course, lose in this scenario, but everybody else will gain, because the evaporation losses reduces a lot when you send it in a pipeline, and that means more water even for the other users down here. The reservoir will still be releasing for them, of course, so there will be flow but less flow. One of the arguments from the farmers was that you would lose money because the power production would go down, which is also true. But if you made a power balance, you could say, what is the reduction in the kilowatt hours per year produced, which was significant, but if then you also count the kilowatt hours needed to pump all this water up, then again it was all green numbers. So the conclusion was the only losers would be these people along the river. But it also showed, since everybody else would actually gain, I mean, they would be even more sure of having enough water, then there should be, in most years, a little extra water available that maybe they could just release and let the farmers have that, right? We didn't look into that, that's politics, right? But I hope they did that. We are getting close to tea break. This one is one of my favorites. In many reservoirs around in India and also around the world, you see that you are basically filling them up every year. So most years they will be spilling, right? And during the dry season, they go down because you use the water. But normally you operate them in such a way that even if the monsoon is late, you don't run out of water, right? So that means that in most years it goes down, and by in June, July, there's still maybe 10% of the water left, and then you fill it up again, right? So the capacity of the reservoir hasn't been fully utilized, right? If you pull it down and there's a few drops left and then it fills up and everybody got all the water they wanted, in a way that would be optimal. The problem is, do you dare do that? Because if the rain doesn't come, and nobody really knows, right? But what you can do is you can take all these historical years you have and correct them for climate change, of course, and then see if that's the inflow that occurs, how will my reservoir perform with the demand that I have for this next season, which we're now planning. And simulating all of this, some of them would then maybe run out of water, but many would not. Looking at all these curves is not practical, so you can make some statistics like this one, which shows for all these many simulations, what is the 50%, so the average you can say, in percentiles of 90%. You're 90% sure of having a level which is at least this. You're 10% sure of having a level of least this one. So that's wet years, average, and dry years, you can say. And this is then what would happen for a demand of about 185. Here you could say, well, maybe what we could do is we go to the farmers and then we show them this and we say, this is what we're going to do. We give you the 185. I know that you might want to do a little extra crop, or you have capacity to grow some more. So we could allocate some water for you, but we cannot guarantee it, right? We allocate a bit more, and then, but if we're unable to supply it, it's your risk, it's not our risk, right? And then you can test, maybe they want a lot of water. If you run that through the model, you find that even on 50%, that's not possible. So that would be too much. But you can run scenarios and maybe end with one like this. Here we have a bit more than 200. So from 185 to 200, an extra 15, which would be fine even in the 90%. Maybe 1 year out of 20 or so, this would fail. But if there was this agreement with the users that either you take an insurance for it or you just accept that this 5% of the years, okay, the monsoon comes so late, I planted the crops, they die, but it's my problem, right? In 19 out of 20 years, you would gain that extra income, right? So I think it's an interesting tool for the authorities to use in negotiation with water users on maybe squeezing a little extra out of the reservoirs without having the liability. Because as it is now, in India at least, and other countries, many other countries, if you suddenly fail to supply the water you have agreed to supply, you have to pay. And then we're back to this one, right? So finding a way, I don't know whether they actually did it in Maharashtra where we discussed it with the authorities, but they might have. So a potential anyway. I think that's probably towards the end of this. Yeah, how much? Another 5 minutes or so. In Palak Basin, which is very dry, the depth to groundwater this is then modeled and measured, was more or less constant up until around 2002, and then it fell for 5-6 years because the rainfall simply reduced. Right. This is actually a case where farmers have agreed to change the cropping, which is very rare in India. They could see, I mean, first of all, the water just wasn't there. But there were a few wells deep enough to take some, and somehow they shared that, but then they shared this very little water and grew something else for that for a while. And we looked into, if you keep doing that, if you now don't go back to the previous way of farming, most likely this would come back up, but it would take about 10 years. All right, let's make the end of that. I think I've talked enough, even though I have a few others. We'll see if there'll be time for that. I think what we'll do is go straight to the lab after the tea break, right? And then continue with exercises. Maybe you can take one of these on the way out. This is the first exercise we will do, and then we'll